performance. I owe you a tiny bit of explanation, or more than tiny, about what's happened. We're ordinarily at the library, as you all know. We had new keys made for that door. Matthew Black has the original key. Matthew's out of town. So we came over with our brand new key to open the door. Didn't open the door. Lynn zoomed home to get more keys to find out if other copies would work. She was stopped for speeding just here. The cop said, "Do you know you were going 77 miles an hour?" And she said, yeah, but I said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "To the library." And she said, "The library?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "There are a lot of people there. Get going." So heartfelt apologies and deep thanks to you for coming. Let me introduce John. He owes, I owe him a proper introduction after
No, you don't.
all this craziness. 100 years ago, there was a
child born in New York.
There was a remarkable woman who wrote an essay about museums and the people who work in them. She was terribly impressed with her fellow professionals, but she added one note of warning. In the world of museums, she said, it often happens that quote, an expert is a person who knows more and more about less and less. If she had the good fortune, this museum woman, to have met John Beardsley, that she wouldn't have had that fear anymore. John is a person who knows more and more about more and more.
Less and less about more.
He's a museum curator, a writer, an art historian, an expert on landscape architecture. He's the director of garden and landscape studies at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington. He knows about Central Park and the Grand Canyon and the quilt makers of Gee's Bend in Alabama. He knows a lot, as you'll hear.
Yeah.
35 years ago, another renowned art curator, Jane Livingston, who's also a friend of Second Friday and also a Rappahannock resident and also a brave soul who stood out in the cold tonight, put together, or had the bright idea for putting together a show on black folk art. She recruited John Beardsley, and the two of them assembled a blockbuster show. It got rave reviews. The Washington Post hailed it as vast and vivid, important and uncanny. Time magazine called it a fiery, marvelous folk show. 2 weeks ago now, the National Gallery just opened a brand new exhibit on folk art, and they paid explicit homage to the game-changing show that Jane and John put together all those years ago. So, John's going to tell us now how they changed the game.
Nothing good was ever easy, right?
So as Ed said, Jane and I organized Black Folk Art in America. It's one of several exhibitions that Jane and I have worked on together that have explored the vast and fabulous world of African American art. We were also responsible with a curator from Houston named Alvia Wardlaw for the Quilts of Gee's Bend, an exhibition that some of you may have heard of and some of you may have seen. It opened in Houston in 2002 and traveled to the Whitney in New York and then traveled for 5 years and spawned a second Gee's Bend exhibition. And so we were involved in that. Jane has also done lots of exhibitions of photography of African Americans, including James Vanderzee and Kate Tolk and Addison Scurlock. Together, we also did an exhibition of the work of a self-taught painter from Alabama, Thornton Dial. So together and singly, we've done lots of work on African American visual culture, and so it's something we are very proud of, and I think it's helped to change the discussion in American art in the 20th century. I also wrote a book called Gardens of Revelation about environment by visionary artists, and it included several African Americans, including Lonnie Colley, and this is Tyree Guyton in Detroit, who took abandoned houses and covered them with found objects and turned them into giant works of sculpture. The book also included the work of Lonnie Colley, known as the Sandman for his carvings of sandstone, but also for what he called his square acre of art in Birmingham, Alabama. He gathered found objects, painted them, assembled them into narrative sculptures, and he's actually become quite a well-known artist. But what I want to do tonight is go back to where it all started for me and for Jane, and talk about Black folk art in America. It was a show that opened in 1982 at the Corcoran and traveled for several years to New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and Detroit and Louisville. And I think it certainly changed us in profound ways, made us much more aware of the presence of many different voices in American art. It also, to some degree, changed the way museums do business in this country, because it wrote African Americans into 20th century art history. So in some modest way, I think it changed the game for American art in the 20th century by writing African Americans into the history of 20th century art and into the history of folk art. So what I want to do tonight is tell you what we did, tell you why we did it, tell you what sort of impact it had at the time, and tell you what its continuing legacy proves to be. Oh, here's the sheriff calling back. Hello? Right, hi, Vicki. Yes. Oh, you're so great. But, well, okay, but here's the thing. Father Tuck offered the church, and so we all moved to St. Peter's. Okay, we've gone back. So we don't need the key, I'm afraid. But you're so nice to call. Anyway, I want to tell you what we did, why we did it, what sort of impact it had at the time, and what its continuing legacy is. You may all want to move a little forward so that you can see the slides, but the exhibition Black Folk Art in America spanned the years 1930 to 1980. It included 20 artists, mostly elderly, mostly rural, mostly southern, and entirely self-taught. So the exhibition opened with the work of William Edmondson, who was a hospital orderly, who later in life started a business as a gravestone carver. And so he carved limestone sculptures that he made available as grave markers, but he also started kind of experimenting with form. There's this amazing sort of abstract crucifix, an owl, an angel. His sort of simple geometric vocabulary attracted a lot of interest from people who are interested in modern art. So Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art got interested in his work, and William Edmondson became the first African American artist to have a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1937. And he was represented in the exhibition by about 20 sculptures, including this amazing Noah's Ark. The exhibition also included the work of a man who had been born a slave, a man named Bill Traylor, who after emancipation stayed on the plantation where he worked as a sharecropper. Late in life, in the 1930s, he moved into Montgomery and lived in the back of a funeral parlor and took up drawing and painting. And a lot of his work are these very abstracted figures, including this drinker, a red dog. He remembered, he painted hunting scenes, like this combination of hunting figures, drinking figures, birds, raccoons, and so forth. It's sort of a self-portrait as an elderly man going about on two canes, and a wonderfully enigmatic doctor figure who may be related to the Baron Samedi, a legendary spirit healer from New Orleans, who was always depicted as going around with a sort of black doctor's bag and a button-up shirt and these amazing spiral eyes. So, and Traylor, again, is someone who has been sort of taken up by the world of modern, taken up in the canon of modern art. He's represented in collections at the Metropolitan, the Museum of Modern Art, and again, it's, I think, this very simple geometric language that bridges with the world of modernism. The exhibition also included elements from James Hampton's amazing Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennium General Assembly. Hampton was a janitor for the General Services Administration by day, and by night he called himself Director of Special Projects for the State of Eternity. And what he made in a rented garage at night was a gold and silver foil-covered environment that was meant to be a setting for the Last Judgment. So it included a throne and offertory tables and pulpits and winged vases, and here's the throne itself. And he collected old furniture and brought it into this rented garage, and then covered it with gold and silver foil and inscriptions. And on one side, the vases and vase stands referred to the prophets, on the other side, the apostles. And it was shown, it was assembled, and other elements of it were, for example, these stars, which were tagged with visions that he recorded. Visions of seeing the Virgin Mary over the Capitol building. He wrote like John, the book of Revelation. He wrote in a cryptic script, recording his own revelation. He also wrote a book of prophecy written by St. James. Now, Hampton's one of the most misunderstood artists in this sort of genre of the visionary or self-taught artist. He was posthumously diagnosed by a couple of mental health professionals as schizophrenic on the basis of these visions that he recorded, for example, on this star. And his work was included in a book called Discovery of the Art of the Insane. But Hampton actually practiced a sort of ecstatic Christianity. His father had been a minister and a follower of this of a belief in what's called premillennial dispensationalism, and which holds that time is divided into 7 eras or dispensations, and that we're in the last dispensation, and it's our job to get ready for the second coming. So he actually practiced this sort of ecstatic Christianity, which was sort of unknown to the contemporary audience, unknown to the art audience, and unknown to the people who decided that he must be mentally ill. Speaking of ecstatic Christianity, the exhibition also included the work of a woman named Sister Gertrude Morgan, who was a self-styled street preacher and evangelist in New Orleans until her death in 1980. She lived in a house she called the Everlasting Gospel Mission, and she painted her house entirely white inside and out, including the floors and the furniture and everything. So we recreated the sense of her house with a white floor and white walls, and hung her work, a lot of which were representations of the New Jerusalem, the new heaven that will come after the old heaven and the old earth pass away. And subsequently, for an exhibition at the Addison Gallery Andover, I recreated this room again with the white furniture, and there's her, you don't see it here, but oh yeah, there it is. She also had a guitar case because she sang her preaching. So she would sing on street corners in New Orleans, and then also in her White House, where she had this vision that she was the bride of Christ, or she would be a bride of Christ, and so she dressed entirely in white as an emblem of her status. The exhibition also included a couple barbers, Ulysses Davis from Savannah, who carved both religious subjects, like this crucifixion, and a whole set of the presidents. So all of them up through John Kennedy, at least. The exhibition also included another barber, Elijah Pierce from Columbus, Ohio, another kind of itinerant preacher who did wood carvings, many of them of biblical scenes, including this amazing crucifixion, which is, it's about 3.5 feet tall. Other subjects included Noah's Ark. The exhibition included several yard artists. These whirligigs are by a man from Patterson, Louisiana, named David Butler, who worked in a lumber mill until he was injured, and then started making sculptures out of snipped tin that adorned his yard and also the side of his house. They had a kind of protective quality, he said. They were sort of sieves to keep bad spirits out of the house. And the yard was full of these fantastical creatures. Here, a winged creature with a gourd hanging from its front, and various walking sticks like this cane with another sort of fantastical creature on it. So the exhibition included some of his whirligigs, the cane, the winged creature with gourds. Another yard artist that was in the show is a guy from Virginia named Leslie Payne. He lived down near Reedville on the Northern Neck and worked in the fishing fleets on the Chesapeake Bay. And so a lot of his work were these wood carvings of fish and also of the fishing fleet out of Reedville. But his preferred mode of transportation was an airplane. And although he never actually went up in the air, he was inspired by an air show he went to as a kid to always want to fly. So he had his own machine shop, and he dressed himself in an aviator's uniform, and he actually made airplanes. And in this last image, you can see this is his machine shop. These are old airplanes, homemade. And they actually had lawnmower engines in them. And so he could drive them around the roads. But until he got ticketed by the local sheriff for driving an unlicensed vehicle.
Not at 77 miles an hour.
So the exhibition included some of his model airplanes and also his tribute to Charles Lindbergh, which we see there in the exhibition. And some World War I era soldiers that he. Another guy from Virginia was in the exhibition, Steve Ashby. He lived up in an old schoolhouse near Delaplane and worked as a farmhand for the McCarty family up near Delaplane. He started making art when his wife died in 1960, and he made figures out of tree branches that he found and cut out faces, and he dressed them in his wife's clothes. He was kind of he had a kind of a bawdy sense of humor, and some of these women had little that were anatomically correct, and they had little plastic cups on their backs, and if you poured water in the plastic cup, it shot through a hole in the figure and came out, well, you can imagine where. He called them pee-pee ladies. Steve Ashby was also responsible for one of the most beautiful little objects in the show, which is this head of a cat. You can see it's got colored marbles for eyes and colored cellophane over the eyes. Steve Ashby is buried on the side of Little Cobbler Mountain near Ada, which is up the road 647 on the way toward Marshall. If you go up a dirt track up Little Cobbler Mountain, there's a sort of unmarked cemetery there in which Steve Ashby is buried. Several women in the show, in addition to Sister Gertrude Morgan. This is Nellie Mae Rowe, who was a housekeeper in Atlanta, lived in Vinings, and made painting and sculpture, and lived by this motto: my house is clean enough to be healthy and dirty enough to be happy. She did this pig on the expressway, which her work is wonderful. Unfortunately, a lot of it was done with felt tip marker pen, and the colors are really fugitive. So some of them are fading out of existence. Just to run through a few of the others, artists that were in the show: Jesse Aaron from Florida, carved wooden totem with multiple faces and a hat. Joseph Yoakum from Chicago, who, like Leslie Payne, sort of dreamed of travel, and based on images of faraway places that he found, probably in postcards and magazines, drew these amazing, fantastical landscapes that he labeled with, this is meant to be the Dolomites in Italy. James Sunford Thomas, who was a blues musician from the Mississippi Delta, and first came to the attention of the sort of folk art community through his music. But he also made these clay heads and skulls, many of which he decorated with human hair and human teeth, and which are related to the sort of tradition of face jugs. And finally, Luster Willis, an artist from rural Mississippi, who in some ways summed up what so many of us felt about this art, which is, this is it. So why did we do this? The simplest explanation is because it's there, because it's great, and because it deserves to be seen. I mean, this art really demands to be seen. There are more complicated explanations, which have to do with, first of all, Jane's arrival in Washington and her exposure to Southern artists through the Corcoran Biennial, and her exposure through those artists from the South to the art of the self-taught. The self-taught artist has always been championed first and foremost, by other artists. So this is an art that artists like. And so Jane traveled around the South a lot in organizing the Corcoran Biennial after she got to Washington in 1975, and started to recognize the strength of the sort of regional visual arts tradition in the South, but also the particular contribution that African Americans made to that visual art tradition. And then Jane and Peter Marzio, who was then the director of the Corcoran, together realized that the Corcoran was a white institution in a black city, and the Corcoran wasn't reaching out to the majority constituency in the city. So they thought about ways to address and to draw in the African American audience in the city, and Jane knew about the strength and importance of tradition of the self-taught artists in the South, and so proposed this exhibition, which is where I came in. I did a lot of the legwork and a lot of the grunt work, and some of the thinking. So that was, so that's what we did and why we did it. What sort of reaction did it generate? Well, Ed, as Ed pointed out, it was a huge critical success. The New York Times, Time Magazine, the Post, and newspapers across the country where the show traveled all celebrated the show and celebrated the artists who were unearthed through the show, or brought to the museum audience through the show. So huge critical success, a popular success. A lot of people saw the show. It was packed on weekends in Washington, which was really gratifying. It generated some controversy, though, because of these terms, black, folk, black and folk especially. To a lot of people, to identify something as black art is to set up a kind of opposition between black art and white art, with an implicitly sort of hierarchical relationship between them. So, and there were complaints about using folk art also, that folk implied a sort of hierarchy between folk and fine. And so fine art is the good stuff and folk art is the kind of curious stuff. Academic folklorists were annoyed with us for using the term folk art because in academic context, folk art, at least at the time, was understood as something passed from generation to generation without much change. So basket making, weaving, ironworking, the kinds of things that would pass from generation to generation pretty much without change. Those were the things that were celebrated as folk art at the time. So there were complaints about using the term folk art. And there were concerns in the black community that we were electing to show self-taught artists as opposed to academically trained artists. And that this issue sort of came to our attention when Dorothy Gilliam, who was then a writer for the Post and was then married to the abstract painter Sam Gilliam, came to the Corcoran and said, why are you showing these basically uneducated country people instead of showing academically trained artists? There are lots of black professional artists who aren't getting museum time, and why are you showing these self-taught artists instead? So Jane handled it incredibly well. She said, "I get it, but come see the show, and then write what you want to." And what Dorothy ended up writing was, yes, it's unfair that African American mainstream or academically trained African American artists don't get time in our mainstream museums, but see this show. So that kind of got us over the hump in terms of the reaction among sort of the black intelligentsia or the black art professionals. So the show was 35 years ago, but oddly enough, it's sort of having its rebirth. Last year, on the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the Black Folk Art Exhibition, Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art in Chicago invited an African American curator named Fahid Najim to organize a show which he called Post-Black Folk Art in America. So he was playing with this idea of that we might be in a post-black era, that we don't define things as, there's no monolithic thing, there's no monolithic identity that's black. So we understand now that African Americans, just like every other group, are diverse within themselves. So you can't identify a single sort of black community. So it's so there's speculation that we might be in a sort of post-black era. I think it's an arguable assumption, but he also in his essay for the catalog was called An Outsider to Outsider. So he also sees himself as a kind of outsider, addressing other kinds of outsiders. And he says the subtitle to his essay was For Post-Folk or Black Folk or Ain't Folk Art Made by Black Folk. So he's trying to scramble things up as much as possible. So he's trying to scramble black art, folk art, and so he's trying to sort of scramble all these different categories so that there's not a monolithic category of black art or folk art. He expanded the sort of range of artists in the exhibition. There were a number of people who didn't want to be in a show that was called post-black folk art. They had an aversion to folk art, so a number of people that he asked to be in the show didn't want to be in the show. At the same time, he included people that we didn't consider for the Black Folk Art exhibition, including the art of prisoners, for example. So art generated by other kinds of physical or social isolation. More recently, the National Gallery of Art has opened this enormous exhibition called Outliers in American Vanguard Art. It just opened on January 28th. And the exhibition explores the relationship between academically trained artists and self-taught artists, and through a range of episodes in the 20th century. So it picks several episodes in 20th century art where the curator, Lynn Cook, argues there were particularly fertile relationships between the art of the inside and the art of the outside, or between academically trained and self-taught artists. So, and one of the episodes she zeroes in on is the Black Folk Art exhibition. So within this exhibition that spans the 20th and early 21st centuries, there is a gallery. A lot of the artists that we featured in the Black Folk Art exhibition are included, and there's a whole gallery devoted to the artists that we presented in Black Folk Art, including William Edmondson, and including some of the actual pieces that we showed in the Black Folk Art exhibition, like Noah's Ark. David Butler is there with his whirly digs. Elijah Pierce is there. There's that crucifix that I showed you that was in our exhibition. James Thomas is there with his clay heads. This one, I swear, looks like George Washington. An artist who was in our exhibition but that I didn't mention before, Sam Doyle, is included in the National Gallery show. The Brown Bomber is a tribute to Joe Louis. Sam Doyle lived on St. Helena Island off the coast of South Carolina and painted not only heroes of African American culture, but also sort of the outstanding characters of St. Helena Island, including the first St. Helena's first black embalmer, John Chisholm. There's Steve Ashby is included in the National Gallery show. This wonderful little vignette of two naked people and a horse with this very fly-looking guy with a grin on his face. I guess they lost more than their shirts when they bought that horse. But next to it is this vignette of a hunter with his gun trained on a black man who sprawled on the ground. Made in the 1960s, but incredibly relevant still. And Sister Gertrude Morgan is there with her Angels of Revelation, the beasts from the Book of Revelation, and also this all-seeing eye. It says across the top, sing, And the text begins, all along on the road to the soul's true abode, there is an eye watching you. And so she, this is the way she preached, by standing on the street and reciting the texts that were part of these paintings. So in a funny way, the Black Folk Art exhibition is sort of passed into history. We no longer control the terms by which it's understood or in which it's discussed. It sort of entered this this larger cultural debate about racial equity, about museum practice, and about the sort of about how diverse American art really is. So it's sort of passed out of our hands and has become now, in a very productive way, I think, part of the discourse around modern American art. So, I'd be happy to answer any questions that might be. Scott?
It's kind of, maybe it's a silly question, but did this change your idea about sort of what is art beyond the notion of the urge to make art, the impulse to make art? Or is that really a relevant question? I mean, how do you determine it as being art the way art has a place in history?
You know, for me, it really, well, and it'd be interesting to hear what Jane has to say about this too, but in some important ways, it confirmed the sort of most basic impulse to make art. Because it's not being made for an audience, it's not being made to make money, it's not being made to make somebody famous. It's being made out of some need to express yourself. So in some ways, this art connects you with the most sort of fundamental aspect of art making, which is the urge simply to make. And then I think it also, in an interesting way, I think it's philosophically really rich, because there's so much content here in terms of individual memory, social history, racial issues, religious issues, the sort of spiritual content. So it confirms all the reasons you might make art other than to have a career. So.
You know, I would just add to that one of the essences of this kind of art is something that John has taken in a direction which I think is really almost more important and more interesting than the discourse around it that's happening now at the National Gallery. John showed the cover to his book called Gardens of Revelation, but you know, many of these artists, in fact, most of them, made work sort of around themselves in the bigger landscape. And they had this sort of desire to make the landscape a part of what they were doing and to sort of honor their yard or their sort of way. And a lot of it is sort of religious imagery. And then John went on to do things, some of the artists that he showed at Dunbar Notes and that sort of outdoor thing. So I think that is a thread in American art. American art and landscape are very closely bound up since the 18th century.
Yeah.
And that's sort of our greatest dream. So yeah,
and there is a very strong environmental impulse among a lot of these artists. James Hampton made an environment that happened to be inside rather than outside, but David Butler and Lonnie Holley and Tyree Guyton and yard art is, I think, a really important aspect of sort of visual arts. In rural areas, and especially among African Americans. So you sort of announce your art to the world by putting it out in your yard in front of your house. And it is a really important dimension of African American self-taught art. There was a question way in the back.
You touched on it a bit, John and Holly famously says, they call me an outsider artist, outside of what? And, you know, you touched on it a bit, but what is our place as curators or museum goers where this work gets to be displayed and gets to be appreciated, but still remains having the type of significance that the artist originally imbued?
So, removing it to the museum really does change the context in which it's seen. I think that's, it diminishes it in some ways, but it brings it to a larger audience. So in that sense, it's a good thing. It diminishes it in the sense that it removes it from the context in which it's made and in which it's best understood. So the example of James Hampton being misunderstood as somebody mentally ill as opposed to somebody who practiced an ecstatic form of Christianity is I think a really good example. It took digging into Hampton's history to provide a context for his work so that it's more readily understood. I like that quote from Lonnie Hawley, they call me an outsider, but outside of what? Because I think that's indicative of the kind of confusion of categories that's going on now. So, who's inside, who's outside, who's got the upper hand at the moment. Whoever is in power at the moment, somebody else is outside. So, I think these categories are still useful. I mean, we probably made a mistake in calling this folk art because it really is more accurately described as the art of the self-taught. So people who aren't academically trained, who aren't cooked according to the usual recipes. We probably would have gotten in less trouble if we hadn't called it folk art. But calling it the art of the self-taught, just doesn't really resonate. So we stirred up a hornet's nest. It's generated a lot of discussion since. There are these categories are I think increasingly elastic, and that's a good thing. And people can move from one category to the next, or from one category to another. So one time they might be seen in the context of folk art, another time in the context of contemporary art, another time in the context of intuitive or outsider art. One other thing I wanted to mention was how much of an impact the exhibition had on collectors and other art institutions. So, for example, when the show went to Chicago, it was seen at the Field Museum, and an African-American artist from Chicago saw the banner for the exhibition, which was Bill Traylor's Snake. And then she went in the show and she said she saw this amazing painting of a guy with a conch shell to his ear, and it was called Dr. Buzz. I don't know if you've read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, but John Barron's sort of crime novel about Savannah. But there's a character in there, Dr. Buzz, or Dr. Buzzard, who again was a sort of spirit healer. And Dr. Buzz was thought to communicate with the world of the spirits by listening to a conch shell. Anyway, she said she went in the show, she saw the banner, this incredible snake, and then she walked in and there was Dr. Buzz with the conch shell to his ear in his doctor bag. And she said, "What is this art?" And so she went on to found an organization in Chicago called Intuit, which was supported largely by contemporary artists in Chicago who were really big fans of this work, the Chicago Imagists, they were called. So the show had this kind of fallout in the sense of generating other kinds of institutions and institutional support for African American outsider artists or self-taught artists, not just African American, but of all kinds. It also inspired a lot of collectors. People who were new to the field, and then some who were already in the field, but whose collecting was redirected. And that was especially true of a guy in Atlanta named Bill Arnett, one of the most controversial characters in the late 20th century art collecting, a voracious collector who sort of scoured the South, especially for work by self-taught artists, and especially self-taught African-American artists, and has an amazing collection, which he's now in the process of trying to, he's given 1,300 works to a foundation, and that foundation in turn is giving the work to other museums, and two museums. So the De Young Museum in San Francisco accepted a big gift, the Metropolitan in New York accepted a big gift, and is opening in May an exhibition of work from this foundation. It's called the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. So this art has gone from, being picked up by the side of the road to exhibitions at the National Gallery and soon the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it's through a lot of small steps by curators, by institutional advocates, by collectors, that it's finally getting into the sort of mainstream narratives of 20th century art.
I'm curious what relationship to this particular art the Outsider Museum in Baltimore.
The Visionary Art Museum, I would, in some ways, Jane, what's Rebecca's story? It was founded by a woman named Rebecca Hochberger, who was very interested in the art of the self-taught.
She saw our show. She loved their show.
Yeah.
And one of the people that she brought in.
Rebecca Hochberger, who founded the Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore, did see the show and loved the show.
She's from an old Baltimore family, quite a wealthy family. And one of the first people that she brought in to work with her was the installation designer for our show at the Corcoran. And the installation design was one of the magical. So Alex Castro actually was the architect for her building. And a lot of the artists in our show were in her original exhibition there.
Yeah.
So that comes directly out of Black Folk Art. And Alex, who did her building and did her installations for a long time, worked with us and was very good.
So the exhibition designer that we used also designed the catalog. He went on to work with Rebecca on that museum. Yeah.
So you were talking about inspiration, and I saw the show at the National Gallery. It seemed to me one of the central arguments and one of the more contestable arguments was that outliers and American vanguard artists played off each other, or at least there was a chain of influence from the outlier artists to vanguard artists. So it's a show that has Cindy Sherman in it, has Kara Walker in it, and there's a gallery with quilts from G's Bend, which includes then quilts that feminist artists made in the 70s and 80s. And I'm just curious about what you think the impact of your show was on contemporary artists, and whether you think that outliers are influencing the insiders in the same way.
Don't quote me, but I think there's a great deal of mutual respect, but it's very hard, I think, to trace direct connections from one to the other. I think that the outliers have had more influence on the insiders than vice versa, but even then, I think there is. It's pretty hard to trace direct influence from.
So you think it's a game of this looks like that, so they have something to do with each other?
Well, I think it's more, what's really important is the kind of support, personal, financial, institutional, that artists have been able to provide, the sort of, the kind of inside artists have been able to provide for the self-taught artists. So artists collecting the work of self-taught artists showing it. So Bill Traylor wouldn't be known to us if it hadn't been for a painter in Montgomery named Charles Shannon, who saw him drawing on the street and started collecting his work. So what I think is important, and Charles Shannon didn't then start painting like Bill Traylor. What he did was save the work and encourage institutions to look at it and to show it. And I don't know, Jane, can you answer this question better than I about this sort of transaction? So I think what's important is the moral support, the financial support that the insiders provided to the outsiders. And I think it's very hard to trace direct influence back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah. John, I think the great thing about folk art, you've got the high level, but appreciation of art goes from the people who work at McDonald's up to the CEO of Apple. But the wonderful thing about folk art is for every, person that you're talking about up here, there are 10, 15, 20 other people out there that are equally as good, but it's affordable to the little people. You can, if you appreciate art or you see somebody's work, they may not be known, but you get to buy an original artwork from somebody, and you don't know 20, 30 years down the road, suddenly you might have bought something. But I think that is, we've been collecting it for 40 years, and that's the great thing about it, is that it's affordable for the little people. And you've got your original artworks.
The little people.
The little people.
Yeah, I've always, I've always argued for a sort of more sort of democratic conception of art. I think too much value is concentrated into too few things. The art world is like the rest of the world, where increasingly a few things are very valuable and everything else is left behind. And I think there's value to be found in a much broader spectrum of creation. And so, that was one of the motivating impulses in this project, was to sort of try to democratize not just institutions, not just the way museums did business, but try to democratize the notion of art. And there's still better art and less good art, but you can find good art across a range of techniques and from a wider range of sources, and speaking to a wider range of social experience, and from a wider range of geographies than we typically see in museums. So I think there's still a lot to be done in terms of democratizing both the way museums do business and democratizing the idea of art. So I think probably last question. Mary Sherman, you did it.
It seems to me that this group of artists are predominantly men. And you did do the Jean's Ben show, which was entirely women. But did you find that there was mostly men who were sort of giving themselves the opportunity to make this work? And were there? I don't know. I just didn't ask.
So I think there were 3 women in the show out of 20. There were several other women that we considered that we didn't include for various reasons. In one case, because a lot of the works somebody had taken up by the market, and a lot of the work appeared to be fake. So, you know, there were, and then I think, like everything else, well, a lot of women came to light in the wake of the exhibition. So, subsequently, we learned a lot. We learned about artists like Bessie Harvey, artists who either worked sort of privately at home or weren't as public about their art. So I think there were probably fewer women in the show than was proportional to I mean, there probably were more women making the art, but they were harder to find. A lot of them, and a lot of them came to light in the wake of the exhibition. So, well, thank you all for sticking with us.